it seemed to be that ideas had the power to make people do things, engage in various kinds of behaviors that would seem to be symptomatic of mental illness. And after a while, he came back to Vienna, wrote with Joseph Breuer, that's Breuer, a pioneering work which they called Studies on Hysteria, in which they had the idea that, as they put it, hysterics suffer from reminiscences. Okay, there's no functional lesion in the nervous system, much less a real lesion in the nervous system. Breuer and Freud had this idea that all hysterical patients had been the victims of some kind of trauma, especially early in childhood. They had repressed this trauma, pushed it outside of conscious awareness, but that the traumatic memory pushed outside of conscious awareness nevertheless erupted into behavior and made itself felt in various ways outside of phenomenal awareness and outside of conscious control, so that the symptoms of hysteria were, for Breuer and Freud, really the unconscious expression of various kinds of repressed memories. It was in that sense, they thought, that hysterics suffered from reminiscences. Breuer and Freud, 1893, that's pretty much the last the thing that Freud ever wrote with anybody else. He pretty quickly broke away from Freud, from Breuer, and developed his own psychoanalytic theory of personality, to which the idea of consciousness, and especially unconscious mental life, is really quite central. There's an evolution here that we can talk about, but I don't want to. What Breuer and Freud really had in mind was that the childhood trauma took the form of some kind of seduction, what we would now call childhood sexual abuse, or some other kind of early traumatic experience that set this whole business of repression in motion. Later on, Freud dumped that theory and produced a theory of infantile sexuality, in which he argued that hysteria was really a reflection not of the child having been seduced, but rather of the child having infantile sexual and aggressive feelings, especially towards his parents. Kind of remarkable in the history of psychology. Freud got it wrong not once but twice. The seduction theory, there's no evidence for that. In the theory of infantile sexuality, it turns out there's no evidence for that either. But that didn't prevent Freud from articulating it and getting quite famous for it. We're still paying the price for that today. But here is, again, this is Freud's diagram of kind of how repression was supposed to operate. Down here in childhood, you had some kind of early sexual experience, but not necessarily traumatic experience. In fact, Freud argued that, yes, there were these sexual experiences in childhood, but they weren't recognized as such by the children themselves, and so they didn't arouse any particular emotion. And then the child would kind of get into puberty and adolescence and begin to have real sexual experiences or real sexual feelings anyway, and that these sexual feelings of puberty and adolescence would revive the memory of this early childhood sexual experience, which memory then became repressed, okay, and along with it a whole bunch of associated memories, and then later on there would be some event in adulthood that would trigger the eruption of this repressed memory, and again it would come out in the form of one kind of symptom or another. Hysterics suffer from reminiscences. Okay, that's a quick comic book history of the evolution of the concept of repression. The most important thing here is kind of the legacy of this 19th century work. The first of these is a distinction that is absolutely central in psychopathology and the study of clinical psychology, and that is the distinction between organic, so-called organic, and so-called functional mental illnesses. Organic mental illnesses are ones that appear in association with palpable brain insult, injury, or disease. Something happens to the nervous system apparently, that could be diagnosed kind of physiologically, and that this organic disorder, this problem either in the anatomy, like brain lesions, or the physiology, like hormones or neurotransmitters or something, accounts for whatever symptom it is that the patient has. But then there are certain forms of mental illness that are functional mental illnesses because they do not appear to be associated with any kind of brain insult, injury, or disease. Now you can smell a little dualism here, in this organic functional distinction, but it's not really a dualistic view of mental illness, because even those who argued for this functional category of mental illness always agreed that mental life was a product of brain activity. They were all materialists in that sense. But what they wanted to argue was that abnormalities in the nervous system could not account for the symptoms that these patients displayed. Another distinction that's very important, that's also a legacy of this 19th century of psychiatry, is the distinction between the related distinction between somatogenic and psychogenic theories of mental illness. Again, in somatogenic theories of mental illness, there's some kind of biological cause for the symptoms that are associated with them. You can see that today, say in biochemical theories of depression, where there's a problem with the serotonin system and that's what makes you depressed, or in certain theories of schizophrenia, where there might be a problem in the dopamine system, and that makes you have hallucinations and thought disorder and all of that. But there are some forms of mental illness where there aren't those kinds of obvious, palpable, physiological causes in terms of brain lesions or neurotransmitter functioning or whatever, but that rather seem to have psychological causes. Phobias, for example, might be related to a person having an actual negative experience with the object of the phobia. Or you could think of obsessive compulsive disorder as a kind of avoidance learning gone crazy, where the obsessive constantly thinks that there's going to be an explosion in my house, and so compulsively checks the stove to make sure that the gas has been turned off. Again, the best way to think about those kinds of disorders, according to this kind of distinction, is in terms of the meaning of the symptom, okay? The meaning of the patient's behavior arising from some kind of psychological cause. The other legacy of this 19th century psychiatry is an emphasis on the role of trauma. In Janet's doctrine of dissociation, traumatic stress puts strain on the nervous system, which then breaks at its weakest link, affecting functions in tactile sensitivity or the special senses or whatever. And in Freud's system, you've got trauma producing repression of the traumatic event, which then erupts outside of awareness in terms of the symptoms of hysteria. Okay, so all of this comes to us from the 19th century. Many of these same categories remain with us in the diagnostic nomenclature that we now use in psychiatry and clinical psychology. Psychiatry and clinical psychology recognizes a category of mental illnesses known as the dissociative disorders, okay, which involve, in the traditional classification, anomalies or disorders of a person's awareness of memory or identity. And these come in four broad categories. One of these is known as dissociative amnesia. I prefer the older term psychogenic amnesia because it makes a clear distinction between the amnesias observed in the dissociative disorders and the kinds of amnesias observed in neurological cases like the famous patient HM. But in the dissociative amnesia, what happens is the patient cannot consciously remember some event or some series of events from his or her life. Can remember everything else pretty well, knows who he or she is, can identify him or herself, but there are certain kinds of memories, certain kinds of events, or rather certain events, that the person simply can't remember at all. The next step up is what's known as dissociative fugue, or as I prefer, psychogenic fugue, where there's also a loss of memory, but accompanying this loss of memory is a loss of identity. You hear about these cases once in a while, read about them in the newspaper, where the police will find somebody on the street, and the person won't be able to say why he's there, won't be able to tell you who he is, or where he's from, or whatever. He's lost his identity, but he's also lost a certain set of memories. Can't tell you what he's been doing for the last fairly substantial period of time. This is a period of time that's much more substantial than would be covered by something like alcoholic blackout or a traumatic retrograde amnesia or something like that. Famous case from the 19th century, documented by William James himself in the Principles, was in the case of Ansel Bourne, who was a itinerant preacher who lived in Rhode Island, disappeared one day from his family. Nobody knew where he had gone or what he was doing. Sometime later, he woke up one morning in Norristown, Pennsylvania, where he'd been living and operating a candy store. During his time in Norristown, he had apparently no recollection of who he was in Providence, Rhode Island, or what he had been doing there. And after he woke up in Norristown, he recovered his Rhode Island identity, but had no memory of what he had been doing in Norristown and how he had been living. So here, in this classic case of Ansel Bourne, you have a bundle of autobiographical memories, as well as the person's what you want to call semantic memory, semantic self-knowledge about who he is and where he's from and who his relatives are, all of which go out together. These cases of psychogenic fugue were observed with some frequency in World War I, where under the stress of trench warfare, soldiers would just walk away from the trenches and they'd be found years later having set up as a baker in some little French town or whatever. So there you go. So you've got psychogenic amnesia, which is specifically a problem of access to episodic memory, psychogenic fugue or dissociative fugue, which adds on to that a problem with semantic memory as well about the self, which brings us to the third category in these dissociative disorders, what's now known as dissociative identity disorder, but more commonly known as multiple personality disorder. And here, the patient seems to have two coexisting identities, okay? And each of which is associated with the specific pattern of personality characteristics, and each of which is associated with a particular fund of autobiographical memory. And whereas in the fugue state, the person goes into the fugue and just comes out of the fugue, in multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder, the patient will